There we go.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first public meeting of the Stormwater Utility Feasibility Study. This study is funded by a grant from the New Jersey DEP, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. My name is Lynn Brooks-Ovney, and I am a planner with BRS Incorporated. This is our agenda for what we want to hit tonight. Just a note for everyone in case we move too fast or you want to look at something again. All the slides are going to be shared after the presentation, so you can spend time looking at whatever you want. This is just a brief agenda of how we're going to operate tonight, what we're going to cover. First, we're going to talk about stormwater utilities, what they are, and provide some history. We're going to discuss the process and explain it and what's involved with setting up a utility. Next, we're going to hit on the stormwater management and what's currently going on in the stormwater management program in Paterson. And finally, we're going to talk about the needs, opportunities, and priority for stormwater management. And I'm going to introduce you to everyone. The team is made up of a large group of people. First, it's BRS. I am Lynn Brooks-Ovney, and I am with the BRS team. Joining me from BRS is Michael Kolber. He is a planner, and Sonia Martin, an economist. And BRS works with public sector entities on a wide variety of planning and water resources related projects. The next part of the team is Princeton Hydro, and Princeton Hydro specializes in water resources engineering. They also have extensive experience advising on stormwater utilities, and their team includes Clay Emerson, who's a professional engineer and a certified floodplain manager, Jamie Feinstein, a registered landscape architect, and Dana Patterson-Greer, a marketing and communications specialist. With also part of the team is New Jersey Future. New Jersey Future is a nonprofit organization that promotes sensible and equitable growth and redevelopment, as well as infrastructure investments that foster healthy and strong, resilient communities. Lindsay Sigmund Messia is a planner with New Jersey Futures. She is actually the program manager of the New Jersey Future Mainstreaming Green Infrastructure Program. And mainstreaming green infrastructure. The goal is to make green stormwater infrastructure common practice. Finally, with the team in the city of Paterson, we have James McGrath, who is the city engineer for the city of Paterson, and he's with us tonight. I would ask him if he wants to add anything, but I know he has an audio problem on his feed. But jump in, James, if you have anything to add. So everyone who's here from the public, you might be wondering how you fit into this process. We're going to start with an overview of stormwater utilities, how they function, and how they can be beneficial. We're going to learn about the state mandates. And your feedback is going to be crucial to help us understand the needs and priorities surrounding stormwater in your community. But please keep an open mind when hearing others' priorities, because they might not be the same as yours. So before we go any further, I just want to set some ground rules so that we can have a good conversation, recognizing that there are people present who have differing views. So first, if we could just all be respectful to each other, only one person will speak at a time. Please keep an open mind. Please share all relevant information with us. Focus on the interests, not positions. And please be mindful that everyone is responsible for upholding the ground rules. And I'm going to hand it off to Clay Emerson from Princeton Hydro.
Thank you so much, Len. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm thankful for everyone for being here tonight on your own time to hear about this opportunity. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is give you a little bit of background. The expectation for those of you attending tonight is that you likely have perhaps never even heard of a stormwater utility and what it might mean for your community. So we're going to start with the basics. We'll have opportunities to ask questions. I know it's a little awkward not being in person, but we'll have those opportunities. We also have the chat available. Um, so, like all utilities, and similar to many that you are probably familiar with, a stormwater utility is a user fee for a very specific dedicated service. We'll talk about the legal background of this in the state of New Jersey in just a moment. But fees are collected proportional to some use. We'll define use later on. That probably doesn't make much sense to you in this context quite yet, but those users receive some specific benefits of the service of the utility, and they must also have some opportunity to reduce their use and receive a commensurate reduction in fee. So the concept is simple: a dedicated and transparent fee for service. And these images here are just, general stormwater images from around the state. And we know when we talk about stormwater and hydrology and flooding, the image in the upper right is getting harder and harder to find in the state of New Jersey, and especially in and around and upstream of the city of Paterson. So, uh, how might residents benefit from a stormwater utility? It's a photo from an urban community that does have a stormwater utility, and some of the stormwater measures that were done in that city to address flooding and stormwater management with that utility. But this utility would provide a dedicated and stable revenue for stormwater management purposes, and I'm going to use stormwater management kind of interchangeably with flooding and flood control. They aren't necessarily the exact same thing, but they do go hand in hand, and we're talking about the same context here. So, proactive financial planning is something that it brings communities, and the ability to tackle larger capital improvement projects that need to be done and need to be planned for financially, looking ahead, whether it's 2 years or 20 years. And speaking of which, the long-term control plan as it relates to the combined sewer system, and we're going to talk about that later if that's not something you're familiar with. But it gives communities a mechanism to address flooding and improve public safety. Unfortunately, right now, flooding is in the news. It's not going anywhere. It's going to be in the news for decades to come. And it's not getting any easier to manage in built environments like the city of Paterson. So a utility provides those benefits. But what does it mean if we look at the varied landscape of even just within, I mean, the state of New Jersey, but for tonight's discussion, the city of Paterson. So you have, although the city is essentially built out, you have different landscapes even within the city. So you have some areas of the city that, like the Bunker Hill area here on the left, versus a more residential area, and kind of you have everything in between, but these are kind of the extremes. How would a utility assess different property owners in an equitable way? Right now, and this is something I should have pointed out before, everyone, taxpayers within the city, they're, you know, you're paying for the services that your city provides. Um, but I would argue not in an equitable fashion. So when you see sites on the left that are industrial, 100% impervious cover, and then you also have residential properties, albeit rather high density and not a lot of pervious or lawn. There's definitely a different signature to the landscape, and the idea of a fair or equitable approach is something that needs to be considered. So, um, a little bit of background, kind of zooming out from New Jersey on this utility financing. Is it a new thing? The answer to that is both no and yes. There are probably about 3,000 by now, utilities across the country. There are only a few states that don't have any. Um, New Jersey, is one of them, although they are now beginning to creep up in New Jersey, and I think in the next few years there'll be a few more to add to the list within the state. Um, and the reason for that is that only until um, the last, well, 2019 technically is when this act came out that made stormwater utilities feasible legally. Um, in the state of New Jersey. And there were some other things that we all remember that happened right after or around that time period that probably set the clock back a little bit on the formation of them. And that was, of course, the pandemic. But now a number of communities are looking at this option. And what this legislation does, and you can look it up. I'm also not in the habit of reading legislative acts, but this one is rather short and to the point. So if you have continuing interest on this, you can quickly Google search that. Actually, I'll give you a resource of where you can find it in the next slide here. So it authorizes the formation of utilities, stormwater utilities, and as Lynn said, we're partnering on this project with with New Jersey Future, and they have developed in preparation for this act some very excellent, informative um, a website that really can answer all the background questions that you didn't get from my quick explanation in a couple slides here. And thank you, Lindsay, for putting that link in the chat as well. Again, you'll have these slides, you'll have this link. You can click on it right here. And if you have continuing questions, which you probably will on a stormwater utility, I would challenge you not to find the answer on that resource. Okay, so why might a community be interested in this? What kind of leverage, what ability does this give a municipality or a city to be able to do for their residents? Again, I mentioned capital expenditures. The municipalities across the state, it's a game of whack-a-mole. What inlet is falling apart? What pipe is collapsing? What culvert needs replacement? And it's reactive. It's not generally proactive, and that's the case in the city of Paterson, and that's the case across the state in almost all municipalities as well. But what a stormwater utility would do is give you that stable, dedicated revenue stream that can only be used for stormwater management purposes. Those purposes vary widely. You see I've highlighted here the long-term control plan to mitigate the combined sewer overflows, which I'll define. Hopefully, maybe that's a term you're familiar with, but I'll talk about that in a moment. But the ability to a utility would give the city the ability to do a lot of other things, some of which they do currently in limited roles, and some things they don't. And it's from inlet cleaning, street sweeping, inlet repairs, addressing nuisance flooding in different portions of in different wards of the city. And another real big advantage is this last bullet point that I have here, is that it would enable you to go out and seek free money, grants, and other opportunities, where you have that matching funds, dedicated matching funds that other communities might not have, which will put you at the top of the list when you go and perhaps apply for state or federal grants to do stormwater management improvements to address the needs of residents as it relates to flooding. So it's a real benefit. So that's the general concept. Well, how exactly does it work? Is another question. And you might be familiar with a water bill utility like that where, your home or your business may have a water meter that may be a little no different than the one that's pictured here, and um, your fee is based on how much water you use, and you expect certain things from the utility that the water is there for you to use it when you need it. The quality is reliable, and so on and so forth. But with a stormwater utility, things are a little different. We're looking at runoff, right? The inlets and pipes in the street, in the public right of ways, need to be maintained. How do we define use? In this case, we define use as the runoff that a property generates. And you can imagine that in the aerial photo that I had a few slides back, the industrial section of, say, the Bunker Hill area, is going to generate a lot more runoff per acre than maybe a typical residential portion of the city. But what we can do is use these aerial images that are very, not only are they high resolution, we can tell pavement from lawn readily, but they're also getting more and more readily updated. In other words, they're a pretty relevant recent snapshot of what's on the ground. And we can look at, from a city standpoint, we've got this crude equation here that is an oversimplification of the process, but just says, hey, we need to do this much work on our stormwater system as a city, and there's this much total impervious cover in the city, and there's an amount per square foot of impervious cover that needs to come from somewhere. And so that's an oversimplification of it, but this can be done on a property by property, a parcel by parcel basis. And that's kind of your water meter, is these aerial images of how much impervious cover is there. One side note on that is is a stormwater utility also in the state of New Jersey must have a credit system, and they are common in stormwater utilities across the country. Probably more than 90% of the utilities across the country have a credit system. And this is a way to incentivize property owners, not just to maintain any stormwater facilities that they have, and there are very few within the city of Paterson because of the time in which a lot of the development occurred, but also creates an incentive to perhaps retrofit and build some stormwater measures that wouldn't exist in the absence of the utility, and allow those bigger property owners likely the ability to reduce their fee and do something that's going to benefit their neighbors and everyone else downstream. And it also, one thing we see is in some parts of New Jersey, perhaps like Paterson, is there's a lot of legacy impervious cover, maybe that was used at one time and isn't being used, and this provides some of those bigger landowners maybe a reason to replace that with some green space, and get a commensurate reduction in their bill. Even without the credit system, that's something that they could do. So, with that, what is the first step? And the first step is what brings us here today, and that is this feasibility study that, again, has been, as Lynn noted, a grant-funded process for you, for the city to go down this road and see if a stormwater utility is something that will benefit the city residents, and something that they want to further investigate or perhaps implement. And so it's a fact-finding mission. What do we have from a drainage, flooding, stormwater standpoint? What do we really need? And our goal, this team of consultants that Lynn introduced to you, is to provide you with the facts, and the city representatives, most importantly, with the facts, so that those key stakeholders can provide feedback and ultimately decide if this is something that the city should pursue further. So it'll also provide the city with an idea of what a potential structure would look like. So different utilities, depending on the community, the nature of the community, the size and things like that, um, will what that framework, that fee structure might look like. And there is an advisory. Thank you, Jamie, for pointing that out. There is an advisory committee that we're working with that brings specific representatives from across the city, from different wards, um, and different interest groups. And we'll talk about those meetings in just a second. But they've been involved. And with that, I'll hand it over to Lynn again to show kind of where we are in the process.
Thank you, Clay. So this slide and the next slide are basically an overview of the process laid out with key highlight steps highlighted along the way. This image reflects all the steps that have actually already occurred and the timeline of the grants. The next slide, this slide looks forward for about 6 months and projects some of the key milestones that will occur during this time period. So you'll note that this is the first public meeting in blue, and there are 2 other public meetings that will occur as part of the process. And you might want to note that the advisory committee, which we're also working with, is highlighted with the meetings in orange. And there are a total of 5 of them. So lots of conversations, lots of different people, lots of different stakeholders at the table. So does anyone have a question about anything that's been covered to this point that they just don't grasp or want us to just refocus on?
Hello, my name is Martin. Thanks, guys, for doing this. Patterson resident, and just had a question about what I think Clay you mentioned. Like, I just want to get if you guys can put it for crayons for me, you mentioned like being a property owner or say a large property owner. How would you participate exactly? It's not as clear to me as to how I would be a contributing factor to helping with the stormwater utility. From an individual property owner standpoint.
Thank you for your question. Are you asking how you can participate in the process or how you would participate in a stormwater utility?
Utility.
So first, the public meeting is to kind of lay out the process for creating a stormwater utilities. Patterson doesn't have one yet. So part of this meeting is to kind of get your input in what you.
I mean, my question is more like in the future, like if we had one.
Okay.
Clay, I could have misunderstood your framing, but is it just some central utility and that's it? Or is there an individual way property owners can be additive to, I don't know, the water collection? I don't know. I wasn't exactly following, which is why I'm asking.
No, that's okay. I think I know. I think I understand your question, Lynn. I think what he's saying is, well, Martin, if, and this is the question, the big if the city of Patterson were to implement a stormwater utility, and that's what this is, a feasibility study to determine if that's in the city's best interest, right? So there's that big if, and that's what this whole process is about, is to decide if they should have one or not. But if they do decide to implement one, every property owner in the city would be participating in the stormwater utility, in total. Every parcel would be, because every parcel has land area and generally, I'm generalizing here, some impervious cover. So and of course the utility would fund things like, like I said, street sweeping, inlet clearing, upgrades to pipe networks to eliminate nuisance flooding and things like that. So every parcel in the city would, if there was one implemented, would technically be participating in the utility. And that participation could just be, okay, we're in it, here's what my property is assessed with, and from an impervious cover standpoint, and and that would be that. Or it could be a little more active participation, like I said, participating in the credit system. That would be an optional thing that a property owner, perhaps like yourself, could do. Um, but if the city were to adopt um, or implement a utility, every property owner would not have a choice to participate. It would be a citywide process that would include every parcel. And I didn't make that clear. I think it's a fair question.
Great. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions from anything we've discussed up to this point? If there are no other questions, I'm going to hand it over to Clay to pick it up.
All right. So as the uh, animation here suggests, let's dive in. So a little bit more, we've just so far just covered the concept of a utility, and I did have some images, familiarize like the landscape of the city, which you all don't need. But let's talk about stormwater management in New Jersey in general, and stormwater in the city of Patterson. So again, as I said earlier, flooding is increasing due to increased rainfall and specifically the intensity of that rainfall, um, and uh, and also upstream development. And that's, Patterson, as I say, we all live downstream from someone, and Patterson is a good example of that, with the river. Um, but these short, intense storms that we're seeing, in my experience, especially in the last 6 to 10 years, overwhelm existing drainage systems, things that are already, and there's a water quality non-point source, we call it pollution, that also results from these kind of rain events. But just like me, the infrastructure isn't getting any younger. Pipes that were put in the ground, 50 years ago, or in some cases in an environment like this, you know, 100 years ago. I mean, there's that you can find some really ancient infrastructure. None of it's getting any younger, and the condition is falling apart. So these two factors between the increased rainfall intensity of these short duration storms, and the fact that the infrastructure is in many cases falling apart, exacerbates the problem. To add to it, the new MS4 permit. This is the state's permitting program, part of the Clean Water Act, or have added some requirements that make it a little harder for municipalities. They have to do more work. And I do see a general comment about stormwater utilities. Yes, Philadelphia. In fact, one of the images that I showed was from Philadelphia, where they have a similar system. So the current issues in Patterson, and some of this is from information uh, from the city, and then also from members of the advisory committee. And this is a brief, a Cliff Note version of a Cliff Note version summary. But nuisance flooding, and what I mean by nuisance flood, the city really experiences, unfortunately, two different kinds of flooding. You have the flooding in these short duration storms that occurs in streets that may damage property and vehicles from time to time as a result of water not getting into inlets quickly enough, whether they're not big enough or periodically clogged with debris. And then you also have flooding associated with the river. So flooding is something that's not news to residents of the city, and it causes disruptions to business, including major disruptions, we understand, to the school district, including relatively frequent, it seemed to me, closures of the school district. Property damage, as I mentioned, economic loss to flooding of homes and businesses. Some specific places have been highlighted. Equity, the current system, just a couple more items there. Equity, the current system doesn't hold all users accountable for their contribution, based on the impervious cover. And there's a perception of lack of enforcement and education as it relates to flooding. So some more specific challenges. Again, I mentioned the localized flooding, the impaired waterways, and then meeting these state and federal mandates as it relates to your long-term control plan, or LTCP. Um, and I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. But right now, there's no dedicated source of funding for sewer and storm system or flood-related issues. Obviously, there's um, the sewer utility, and that's kind of a separate issue that we will touch on. And there's also staffing shortages from the city's perspective within the sewer division. So I've mentioned this a couple times, and perhaps I should have moved this slide up a little bit further, but the city of Paterson is a little more complex than the average municipality in the state of New Jersey, in that large portions of the city are the rainfall that lands in those large portions of the city actually go not directly to the river, but go to a wastewater treatment plant first. And you might say, well, that's a great idea, but as it turns out, it's not the best situation, because when it rains um, particularly intensely, or sometimes not even that intense, the treatment plant can't handle both the sewage, the raw sewage that's coming in addition to the rainfall that's also being captured by the same sewer system. And what happens is the sewer system overflows into the river. So rainwater is mixed with raw sewage, and this is a reality for the city of Paterson. It's a reality for a lot of the urban areas across the state and country, and even some smaller areas that rely on relatively old combined sewer systems. Alternatively, and there are small portions of the city, and maybe your average municipality, if there is such a thing in New Jersey, is what we call an MS4, and that's an acronym for Municipal Separate Storm Sewer Systems, where the storm drains are separate uh, and do not flow to the wastewater treatment plant, and instead are piped, um, hopefully to a stormwater management system, but ultimately to a stream or river or lake or some kind of receiving water body. So it's just the take home on this slide is just that it's important to understand that in an urban environment like the city of Paterson, we have a majority of CSO, combined sewer system, and the CSO stands for combined sewer overflow, which is what we're trying to avoid and what you have that long-term control plan um, directive to address. All right, so um, and then just a little bit wider perspective. It's not just the city of Paterson. There you are on the map, but it's part of a larger community that crosses not just municipal borders, but county borders, um, and also New York State. So it's a complex system of and a large drainage area that ultimately flows by um, the city of Paterson. So I mentioned the relative proportions of the combined sewer service area within Paterson and the MS4. And again, it's close to 90%, 88% of the city um, is within that image that I had on the left there. And only 12% of the city is actually separate. So that presents um, its own complications. And of course, the Passaic Valley Sewerage Commission is the one that's in charge of that. So I will hand it over at this point. I'll hand it over to Jamie to take a deeper dive into some of the current services and things that are going on in the city as it relates to a utility.
Thanks for all of that, Clay. And thanks everyone for being here tonight. So I hope you're all still awake. It's kind of a dry subject, no pun intended, but kind of segueing off of what Clay has been talking about this whole time, is what, all these things are contributing to what's happening in Patterson. So as part of this study, what are we doing to understand what's happening in Patterson? Because every municipality, Sandra, kind of like your question, Philadelphia has a stormwater utility, but every municipality is different, and every program needs to be tailored to the exact situation that people are experiencing and that the city is experiencing in terms of flooding, infrastructure failures, population density, impervious area. So many factors can be different. So we have been working with the city staff, James and his staff, to understand what the current stormwater program is in Patterson. What is the city staff doing now? What is money being spent on? It's being spent on a lot of things, but it's never enough, and everything by necessity at the current time is reactive, and that's in no way a criticism of the municipal staff. It's just, you have a combination of things going on, aging infrastructure, increasingly intense storm events, and the need for regulatory compliance. So I think the big piece of the story is that repairing, listing and prioritizing and replacing lines and structures when they're broken is the top of the list. Lateral failures, tracking the locations of repeated blockages so that staff can be aware and on top of consistent problems and try to make them, fix them, even if it's a short-term fix. And reporting to the EPA quarterly for the operation of the CSO system. Michael, can you just go back a slide for a sec? Sorry. That's a lot of effort. So I think the bottom line here is that the fees that you're paying in your sewer utility bill, like, they are going into a general fund in the city, and then that funding is used for a variety of municipal needs, not just the sewer system. So the funds are allocated as they can be to address the most pressing issues. And as you know, the residential sewer fees are a flat rate. You don't have a sewer meter. So I know there's been discussions in the past about equity, and those same kind of discussions will be part of this, because the idea is that using impervious area is a way to make it a little bit more equitable across the board. Thank you. Sorry, I've got scratchy throat evening going on here. So to kind of elaborate on some of the other current services, I call them invisible services, because they're just, stormwater just isn't sexy. The sewer is not sexy. It's the kind of thing you just don't want to, it's invisible until it's a problem, and then it's very visible. So all the services that are listed on this slide are performed by a combination of your in-house staff. So that's your Department of Public Works, which includes engineering, the sewer division, the streets division, and outside contractors that are performing all of these different tasks. And because you're in a combined sewer system, these tasks are both stormwater and sanitary sewer related. I won't read them to you, but just kind of thinking through how that actually operates in a city, in a big city like Patterson. This is just kind of a snippet of the organizational structure that supports stormwater and sewer. And when you think about it, how it runs through an organization, I mean, there's departments in here and divisions in here that you wouldn't even necessarily consider. Administration, Department of Finance, they're responsible for working with the Division of Revenue Collections and sewer billing to collect fees. That it requires a database. There's just lots of hands that are touching stormwater as it moves through the city. I mean, we can also add emergency services, police and fire in here as they're responding to flooding emergencies. DPW responds to emergencies with, specifically to the infrastructure. And we could even include planning and zoning as they're reviewing applications for site development plans that have to enforce, the current ordinances and regulations. And then, of course, we have the Passaic Valley Sewerage Authority, who receives funds from the city that we're paying to treat the stormwater using the pieces of infrastructure that are under their purview. Next slide, please. So we're talking about a lot of disparate pieces that are all functioning together in some way. So this is just kind of another way to look at the current program and where funds and where effort is being allocated. So we've kind of got the 4 areas: capital, regulatory, M&O, and personnel. Capital improvements include things like design and construction of major projects, as opposed to kind of like day-to-day improvement or repairs. Regulatory compliance is a large source of coordination and labor, doing field inspections, monitoring water quality, writing reports to both the state and the federal agencies to make sure that the system is in compliance and doing what it's supposed to be. Anytime there's I'm forgetting the word. I'll come back to that. But, anytime there's a problem, basically, and they're out of compliance, that has to be recorded and dealt with, and correspondence. And who's doing that? The personnel. So that's your personnel and engineering, Department of Public Works, consultants and contractors that are reporting to those folks. And then again, maintenance and operations. That's your daily boots on the ground, repair, cleaning, making sure the system is functioning on a day-to-day basis. So where does all of that information get us, and how are we supposed to evaluate that? And so what we are trying to do now is really understand what is being spent currently on stormwater. And there's a lot of different ways, that funds are kind of broken up. So these are just kind of a few examples of how money is distributed in relation to sewer and stormwater. So what does this do? This really gives us an idea of where we are now, how much is what we are doing now costing, and we know what we have to do, right? We have the long-term control plan, which has aspects of sewer separation, additional storage, reducing peak flows. It's a long-term plan. It's got a lot of pieces that can last the next 50 years, and all of that needs funding. So we don't know where we need to get in terms of a sewer utility and fees until we know where we're trying to go. And where we're trying to go is going to be a combination of where the citizens and business owners in Paterson want to go, where compliance needs us to go, and where infrastructure also needs us to go. And of course, a sewer utility fee is not the only way of funding these things, but as Clay had mentioned before, it does offer a dedicated stream of revenue. So there is money available to fund these things. I'm not saying, everything is going to be perfect and flooding will disappear once a sewer utility is established. This is, again, this is a long-term process, similar to any other utility. And I think the goal is that working with the combination of factors you have is to find a happy medium of what people can tolerate as far as payment and what people need as far as, a quality of life. Next slide, please. So, I mean, to really break this down into like the bare bones components, we're talking about stormwater funding does not equal the total stormwater program needs right now. Lack of adequate funding and staffing, and it takes away the ability to prioritize and enact a proactive work plan. The work also needs to be done for these regulatory compliance items that we've talked about. And so what we're left with is increasing costs to address required infrastructure work. No matter what we do, even if you do or do not enact a stormwater utility, the costs aren't going away. So this is an opportunity to really look at how we can increase revenue capacity in an equitable way to address the needs. And, what are the values that Paterson brings to this, and what's important to your community? So with that, I will pass it back to Lynn and we can open the discussion.
So,
Hello, my name is Sandra Bosk. I see it as a great program. I studied it when I was in school. We did a whole thing on Philadelphia. But unfortunately, I don't see the city council approving something like that. They hear one business owner or resident complaining about adding this sewer utility tax, and they'll shut it right down.
Well, we thank you for that candid statement. Truthfully, Sandra. But I will say that, you know, the city, our job in this feasibility study is to gather the facts and you know, and lay out what this could provide for residents. And but ultimately, you know, the decision is with the city. But we understand there's a variety of opinions and different outlooks for what the city needs, what the city doesn't need, and our goal is to provide those facts and hope that the decision making process is in the best interest of you know, the residents as a whole and this and the future of the city. So we're going to do that, but we thank you for that opinion, truthfully. Do you have anything to add? Maybe things that in this process we can look at that might provide information that I'm not saying, you know, what, you know, we can
I don't
change
remember
opinions,
the
but-
intricacies of but I remember it from, we studied this like good 10 years ago, and I thought it was a fabulous program. They had a lot of little things that they did, like at the top of the hill and digging it out, put trenches and have stormwater running into the trenches and water the trees. There were so many different little things that they did, and it was a wonderful program. But getting people to understand it is the problem.
It always is. That's right. That is the challenge, is getting people to understand it and see how it could work for them. So, you know, that's what we're charged with doing. And hopefully, if the decision is not to go with it, it's a well-informed one. But that's our burden to bear. So
I currently
appreciate it.
work for Passaic County as environmental specialist and trying to get people to understand you can't put things down a storm drain. They just said, well, no, that's what you're supposed to. And no, it's not. It's only for stormwater. That's a
Right.
hard concept.
I know, and that's the baby steps.
I believe we already addressed what the question in the chat. The question was about, is this the same program that was enacted in Philadelphia? And Philadelphia does have a stormwater utility. Did Clay or Jamie, did you want to add anything else to that?
Just that, yeah, I guess they've really had it for a long time. The big change, is until like maybe 2014, their utility was kind of censusly based on the size of your water main to your property, which really has nothing to do with how much stormwater runoff your property makes. So starting in about 2014 is when they, did the same thing that we're talking about here and used that property's, you know, physical characteristics, the impervious cover specifically, as kind of a better estimate of the runoff. And they have similar credit programs and incentives for property owners, both small and large, to do some of those projects that Sandra was kind of summarizing there, ways to get runoff off the streets and you know, use it to beautify and green kind of the urban otherwise urban landscape. So, you know, there are examples not too far away from the city of Patterson of how this can work and benefit both residents and people who work in the city. So, you know, hopefully it's something that will happen here. But again, our job is to just inform the process. And I do see another question in the chat here. And I'll go ahead and take that if that's all right, Lindsay.
Yeah, just for the recording, let me just read it.
Please.
What incentives would entice property owners to remove legacy impervious surfaces? How much impervious cover would need to be transformed to make a substantial impact? Good question.
Yeah. Yeah, very good question, and two questions. I'll answer the first one first. A property owner, if where a stormwater utility exists, typically a non-residential property owner, say an owner of a business or maybe some other kind of larger scale property, they would get a bill that says you have this much impervious cover on your property, and they might look at that bill and say, well, they're right. I do have 4 acres of impervious cover, but I haven't parked anything on an acre of that, and I have no intention of parking or storing or doing anything. Why am I paying for that? And so they might decide to remove some impervious cover that's not being used anymore, um, and and get a commensurate reduction in the fee that they're paying. Now they would have to do the economics on that and decide, like, do I really want to tear up this pavement? How much is that going to cost me to do? How many years is that going to take to be a return on that investment? And those are the decisions that people make all the time for other things. So that's the incentive, would be to lower their utility fee. And the next question is a little more complicated, or maybe it's a little easier depending on my approach here. How much impervious cover would need to be transformed to make a substantial impact? Well, if we're talking about the Passaic River, the flooding associated with the Passaic River, the city of Paterson has little control over that. That's a fact, and that's why we showed that watershed map of how big the watershed is. But from what we understand within the city of Paterson and within any other relatively high density urban area, not all of your flooding is associated with the large, multi-state watershed that is the Passaic River. Sometimes it's these short thunderstorms where maybe the river's, down low at its normal stage, and you have these intense thunderstorms that can cause what we tend to call nuisance flooding, but still that has a toll on residents, socially and financially. And there, the removal of some impervious cover in some key areas, depending on the drainage network, could start to realize some benefits in that maybe areas that flooded before don't flood anymore during these shorter duration, downpours that have seemed to become more and more frequent. So it's a really complicated question that depends on the scale, how big the drainage area is, and exactly where the inlets are and what's going on. But you can start to see some benefit on the extremely local scale from projects like that, whether it's removing impervious cover or putting stormwater retrofits where they don't currently exist. That's a really good question, Thomas. And again, I think as Jamie said, a stormwater utility isn't going to instantly fix flooding in the city of Paterson, but what it's going to do is give the city of Paterson a serious long-term tool to start chipping away at it, prioritizing projects, getting a long-term plan on what to do first, understanding the problem areas better, and addressing them one by one.
I would just like to add that depending on how the utility is set up, reducing impervious cover may not be the only mechanism for getting that reduction. The installation of green infrastructure can be another mechanism for that. So the installation of rain barrels on your property or a green roof or mechanisms like that, which doesn't reduce the impervious cover on your property, but can slow the entry of water into the system or capture it in other ways. That can be another alternative mechanism for getting a reduction in your services. So there are options for people to make a difference in both your bill and in your property and your neighborhood.
Oh, thank you both. So if anyone has other questions, of course, feel free to use the chat, but also feel free to either click raise hand or just come off of mute if you have another question. I'll pause for a moment, but we did receive just general comments. So when you registered for the meeting, we did ask if you had any questions for the project team. We received a few comments, which I know, Clay, you were addressing in your comments about flooding, but just to share them with the group. One comment included that projects funded by a stormwater utility should be located in flood-prone areas. And there was another comment about flood control laws or ordinances, but a misunderstanding regarding enforcement or lack of enforcement. I'm not exactly sure if that's the flood control ordinance as far as flood zones or the stormwater ordinance, but both comments were about flood control and stormwater. So I don't know if Clay or anyone else on the call wanted to address those comments, but I just thought I would share those.
Sure, I would just add, to well, they're both flood related, and that's a serious concern in the city, and only going to get more of a concern, unfortunately, um, at least in the near future. But to the both of those comments, I would say that a stormwater utility gives you that mechanism to better educate, better enforce, if that's the case, implied by the one comment. Sound practices as it relates to flood mitigation, flood management, flood prevention. Um, so even in the first advisory committee meeting, we heard plenty of concerns about flooding. So it's not surprising that some of the comments coming into this meeting are on those same lines. And we see that in most communities. Some communities have more water quality focus to some extent, but for the most part, flooding is the issue. And you know, if you want to tackle it in a proactive manner and not playing whack-a-mole, like I think I used the example, a utility gives you that tool, and that goes beyond fixing inlets and pipes. It's also education and enforcement, emergency response, and things like that.
Does anyone else on the call have a question or a comment? You could just feel free to come off of mute.
Michael, I think you could also advance the slide and it might bring up some new thoughts to the next. So these are just a few kind of questions. I mean, the major question is, what do you think that the priorities the city should address? I mean, obviously, flooding we've talked about. We have gone through some of the things on this bullet list, and these are just seeds. I don't know if this brings anything up for anyone.
I think this talks to some of the points that were kind of raised in those comments that Lindsay mentioned, both the education here and enforcement. Michael mentioned the credit system and the fact that it could be an incentive to implement some of those things that Sandra brought up. Those more innovative stormwater practices, or green infrastructure, as it's called, a way to manage stormwater and also, bring some trees and green into the cityscape. So these are things that we did hear a lot of these in the first advisory committee meeting, but maybe some of these bullet points are things that hit a tone with some of you, or maybe not.
I guess, does anyone have any comments or thoughts or?
Seeing anything in the chat or anyone hand raised or trying to come off of mute, but we still have a good amount of time remaining in the meeting, so feel free to come off mute if you have any questions or comments.
Yeah, I mean, we can also kind of talk through some of the next steps and.
So just some of the things that we're doing as part of the consultant team is we're working on completing an impervious area mapping, looking at all the impervious area in the city of Patterson. And also finalizing a memo on the current program costs. We're looking at reviewing all the future needs and priorities, which the previous slide highlighted all the all things that need to be addressed, but they all get prioritized. And then we have to conduct an analysis of who pays what now and what they would pay under utility. And our second public meeting is, the date is not finalized, but it will take place in January. It'll be after all the holidays. So, you could put us on your calendar.
Yeah, and at that meeting, the kind of the bulk of what we would plan to share with you is the analysis of that impervious area mapping and kind of discussing what that looks like in the city of Patterson. And then also looking at that analysis of who's paying now and how that might shift under a utility, where, basically ratepayers that have larger impervious areas would be, the assumption is that ratepayers with larger impervious areas would take up more of that pie, if you will.
Does anyone want to share any thoughts? Are there any questions that we haven't answered or that you really want to ask?
So
Well-
I'm just going to say that if you think of something after this meeting, this is not your last opportunity to speak. I will put my email address in the chat. So if somebody wants to reach out with an additional question or thought, you can do so. So this is not your last opportunity, and we will obviously have 2 more public engagement meetings as part of this process. So you'll be able to hear more about how this process is going and what some of the additional information we're providing is.
And another thing, everyone who came tonight, another thing that you can do is sort of spread the word for the second public meeting so we could bring more people into the conversation.
Yeah, that would be extremely helpful. As Lindsay noted, this will be posted to the engineering website for the city, so you can review the details again, relive the experience. But we do appreciate everyone's time and effort, and your time just hearing what we have to say as we embark on this feasibility study, and as Lynn said, spread the word especially if you think it's something that's worth knowing more about. Public participation is a good component of this project, and we hope that we can educate as many people as possible, and that the community can make the best decision on a potential utility and what it might do for the city.
Yeah,
I don't know if
and to be extra clear, we're not looking for supporters necessarily. We're just looking for everybody to come and voice their opinion, their concerns. Little personal anecdote, I had the great pleasure of doing a feasibility study in the town that I live in. And so I would sit at my desk every day and I would hear my neighbors across the street, just to freak out basically and talk about the issues. And, I think they came to a good place. We did not enact a utility at this time, but it was just good to hear someone talking and trying to understand what people are thinking. So, I think everyone's candid responses, even if it's like, what the hell, I think that's really helpful, because we're all just here to have a conversation about this and get down to what is going to be helpful for you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, so much. And hopefully we'll see you at the next meeting.
Yes, thanks a lot.
Thank you for having